September 1st, 1939. The world watched in horror as German forces crashed across the Polish border. The Blitzkrieg, a terrifying new form of mechanized warfare, had begun its deadly work. But what happened in the weeks that followed would reveal both the ruthless effectiveness of the German war machine and the painful limitations of the Western response. The invasion of Poland was not just a military campaign. It was a brutal lesson in modern warfare, a preview of the devastation that would soon engulf the entire European continent. Poland, a nation of ancient history and fierce pride, stood alone against the combined might of Nazi Germany and, as events would soon unfold, the Soviet Union. The Western Allies, bound by treaty to defend Poland, declared war but could offer no direct military assistance. This is the story of Poland's desperate struggle for survival against impossible odds, and of the strange, deceptive quiet that followed its heartbreaking fall. To understand the Polish tragedy, we must first understand the Polish Army of 1939. On paper, it was a formidable force, with nearly 1 million men under arms. It was organized into 30 infantry divisions, 11 cavalry brigades, 2 mechanized brigades, and supported by an air force with over 400 combat aircraft. Poland had been an independent nation for only 21 years, having regained its sovereignty after World War I, but it had built its military with great sacrifice and national pride. However, the reality was far less impressive than the paper strength suggested. Poland's military was equipped largely with outdated equipment, a legacy of limited industrialization and economic hardship during the Great Depression. The Polish Air Force, though manned by brave and skilled pilots, was outnumbered and outclassed by the modern German Luftwaffe. Many of its fighters, like the PZL-P.11, were open-cockpit biplanes and monoplanes that were already obsolete compared to the Messerschmitt Bf 109. Polish tanks were mostly light reconnaissance vehicles, like the 7TP and the TK3 tankettes, armed only with machine guns or small cannon. They were no match for the Panzer IIIs and IVs that spearheaded the German assault, which were better armored, better armed, and more reliable. The Polish High Command, led by Marshal Edward Rydz Śmigły, made a critical strategic error. They deployed their forces along Poland's long and vulnerable borders, a frontier stretching over 3,500 kilometers. This forward defense strategy was designed to protect Polish territory at all costs, but it stretched the Polish lines dangerously thin. The generals believed they could trade space for time, fighting a delaying action while the Western Allies launched an offensive against Germany from the west. That offensive never came. The German plan, codenamed Fall Weiss, or Case White, was brilliantly conceived and ruthlessly executed. 2 massive army groups would strike simultaneously. Army Group North, commanded by General Fedor von Bock, would attack from Pomerania and East Prussia, driving southward. Army Group South, commanded by General Gerd von Rundstedt, would strike from Silesia and Slovakia, driving northeastward. Together, they would form a giant pincer movement, encircling and destroying Polish forces west of the Vistula River. General Heinz Guderian, the chief theorist of armored warfare, was given command of the 19 Army Corps and would prove instrumental in demonstrating the devastating power of the Panzer Division. The German advantage was not just in numbers, but in doctrine and technology. The Blitzkrieg, or Lightning War, was more than just tanks and aircraft. It was a fully coordinated combined arms assault, a symphony of destruction where every element worked together with devastating precision. The concept had been developed by German military thinkers during the interwar period, men like Heinz Guderian and Erich von Manstein, who had studied the failed trench warfare of World War I and sought a way to break the deadlock. At the heart of the Blitzkrieg was the Panzer Division. Each division contained hundreds of tanks, supported by motorized infantry and armored personnel carriers, self-propelled artillery, and combat engineers. These formations did not advance in a slow, linear fashion. Instead, they concentrated their force at a single, narrow point of the enemy line, the Schwerpunkt, the main point of effort. They punched through the defensive positions and then, instead of pausing to consolidate, they kept moving, racing deep into the enemy's rear areas. Once the panzers had breached the front, they created chaos behind the lines. They attacked headquarters, artillery positions, supply depots, and communication centers. Polish units, cut off from their commanders and running low on ammunition and supplies, found themselves isolated and surrounded. The Stuka dive bomber, the Junkers Ju-87, with its distinctive inverted gull wings and terrifying screaming siren, acted as flying artillery. It would plummet almost vertically onto its targets, dropping bombs with remarkable accuracy and spreading terror among both soldiers and civilians. The psychological effect of the Stuka's attack was often as devastating as the physical damage it inflicted. The speed of the German advance stunned the world. Polish units, fighting bravely but unable to coordinate effectively, were overwhelmed before they could properly react. The German 4th Panzer Division reached the outskirts of Warsaw on September 8, just 1 week after the invasion began. The Polish capital was now under direct threat, and the civilian population began digging defensive positions, preparing for a siege that would test the very limits of human endurance. The Blitzkrieg had achieved its first spectacular success, but Poland was about to show that it would not fall without a fight. Despite the overwhelming odds and the relentless German advance, the Polish army fought with remarkable courage. The most significant Polish counteroffensive of the entire campaign was the Battle of the Bzura, fought between September 9 and September 19. It was a desperate gamble, a bold attempt to turn the tide of the invasion. Polish forces under the command of General Tadeusz Kutrzyba, commanding the Poznan Army and parts of the Pomorze Army, launched a surprise attack against the exposed flank of the German 8th Army, which was advancing on Warsaw from the west. For several days, the Poles achieved remarkable success. They caught the Germans off guard, pushed them back several kilometers, and inflicted heavy casualties. Polish cavalry, fighting as mounted infantry, dismounted and engaged German positions with rifles and machine guns. Polish infantry, supported by what little artillery they had left, advanced through the forests and fields of western Poland with a ferocity that surprised even their commanders. For a brief, shining moment, it seemed possible that the Polish offensive might achieve the impossible and force the Germans to pause their advance. But German air superiority soon proved decisive. The Luftwaffe, which had been temporarily diverted by weather and other operations, now turned its full attention to the Bzura pocket. Stuka dive bombers and Heinkel He-111 medium bombers pounded Polish positions mercilessly. Supply columns were destroyed. Reinforcements were bombed before they could reach the front. The Polish offensive, starved of supplies and subjected to relentless aerial attack, gradually ground to a halt. German reinforcements arrived, including panzer divisions that had been racing toward Warsaw. The Poles, now exhausted and running low on ammunition, were surrounded. The Battle of the Bzura ended with a Polish surrender on September 19. Over 20,000 Polish soldiers were killed or wounded. More than 170,000 were taken prisoner. It was the largest single battle of the entire Polish campaign, and while it ended in defeat, it had delayed the German timetable and demonstrated to the world that the Polish army would not surrender without a fierce fight. There is a famous, and largely romanticized, image of Polish cavalry charging German tanks with lances. The truth is more nuanced and in some ways more remarkable. Polish cavalry units were trained as mounted infantry. They used horses for rapid mobility across difficult terrain, but when they reached the battlefield, they dismounted and fought on foot with rifles, machine guns, and anti-tank rifles. There were indeed occasions when cavalry units charged on horseback, but these charges were directed against German infantry positions, not tanks. The myth of lances against panzers has become an enduring symbol of Poland's tragic predicament, but the real story of Polish cavalry is one of adaptability and courage against impossible odds. The situation for Poland went from desperate to catastrophic on September 17, 1939. While the Polish army was fighting for its very survival against Germany in the West, the Soviet Union, bound by the secret protocols of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, launched its own invasion of Poland from the east. This was not a military necessity for the Soviet Union. It was a calculated act of cynical realpolitik, a cold-blooded agreement between two totalitarian powers to divide Eastern Europe between them. Over 460,000 Soviet troops, organized into two fronts, the Belarusian front and the Ukrainian front, poured across the virtually undefended eastern border. The Polish government and military command had not anticipated this betrayal. They had expected the Soviets to remain neutral, based on the Soviet-Polish non-aggression pact signed in 1932. The Soviet invasion came as a devastating psychological blow. The Poles were now fighting not one, but two enemy armies, on two fronts, with no hope of reinforcement from any direction. The Red Army faced little initial resistance. Most Polish forces were already heavily engaged against the Germans in the West. The few Polish units stationed in the east, primarily the Border Protection Corps, or Korpus Ochrony Pograniczny, fought brief, isolated engagements, but they were hopelessly outnumbered. Soviet propaganda claimed they were protecting the Ukrainian and Belarusian minorities living in eastern Poland, but the real goal was territorial expansion. Stalin was reclaiming lands lost after the Polish-Soviet War of 1919 to 1921 and creating a buffer zone against what he correctly perceived as an inevitable future conflict with Germany. The Polish government and high command now faced an impossible choice. Faced with a two-front war against two of the most powerful armies in Europe, with no hope of victory, they made the painful but necessary decision to evacuate. President Ignacy Mościcki, Marshal Rydz Śmigły, and members of the government crossed into Romania on the night of September 17. They had hoped to reach France and continue the fight from there, but Romania, under German pressure, interned them. This act of evacuation was controversial, seen by some as abandonment, but it allowed the legal continuity of the Polish state. A Polish government in exile was soon established, first in Paris and later in London, and it would lead the Polish resistance for the duration of the war. The Polish armed forces would be rebuilt in exile. Thousands of Polish soldiers escaped through Hungary, Romania, and Lithuania, making their way to France and later to Great Britain. They would fight alongside the Allies in every major theater of the war, from the snowy forests of Norway to the scorching deserts of North Africa, from the beaches of Normandy to the hills of Italy. Their motto, "For your freedom and ours," captured the spirit of a nation that refused to accept defeat. As the German armies tightened their grip around the city, Warsaw prepared for a siege that would become one of the most tragic episodes of the early war. The Polish capital was a city under constant bombardment. The Luftwaffe had been targeting Warsaw since the very first day of the war, September 1st, aiming specifically to break civilian morale and disrupt the functioning of the Polish government. Hospitals, clearly marked with red crosses, were hit. Schools were destroyed. Residential neighborhoods were reduced to rubble. The bombing was relentless, day and night, a deliberate campaign of terror from the air. Despite this, the people of Warsaw showed extraordinary resilience. The city's military commander, General Walerian Chuma, organized the defense with whatever forces were available. Regular army units, National Guard volunteers, and ordinary citizens worked together. Barricades were erected in the streets using overturned trams, furniture, and rubble. Civilians dug trenches and anti-tank ditches with their bare hands. The city's water supply was disrupted, then its electricity. Food became scarce. But the defenders held on, refusing to surrender. On September 25th, the Luftwaffe launched its most intense bombing raid of the entire campaign. It was a massive air assault involving over 400 aircraft, a coordinated effort to break the city's will once and for all. The bombing lasted for hours. The city center was engulfed in flames. The royal castle, a symbol of Polish sovereignty for centuries, was heavily damaged. Thousands of civilians were killed. The stench of smoke and death hung over the city like a shroud. On September 27th, with ammunition all but exhausted, food supplies critically low, and water undrinkable, General Chuma signed the capitulation of Warsaw. Over 140,000 Polish soldiers were taken prisoner, marched off to camps that would become the infamous stalags of the German prison system. The city had held out for 20 days, longer than many military experts had predicted, but the cost was staggering. Over 40,000 civilians were dead. The once beautiful capital, the Paris of the East, was reduced to a smoldering ruin. The Nazis would occupy Warsaw for the next 5 years, a period of unimaginable suffering that would culminate in the systematic destruction of the city after the Warsaw Uprising of 1944. Even after the capitulation of Warsaw, isolated pockets of Polish resistance continued to fight. The Battle of Kock, fought from October 2nd to October 5th, was the last major engagement of the campaign. Polish forces under General Franciszek Kleeberg, a veteran of the Polish legions in World War I, fought a final desperate battle against German forces near the town of Kock in eastern Poland. Outnumbered and running out of ammunition, Kleeberg's men fought with the determination of those who have nothing left to lose but their honor. On October 5th, Kleeberg surrendered. His final order to his troops captured the tragedy and the enduring spirit of the Polish nation. He told them, "We have lost a battle, but we have not lost our honor. Poland is not yet lost. The fight will continue. On October 6, 1939, the last organized Polish military resistance ended. The campaign had lasted only 36 days. Poland, a nation of over 35 million people, had been defeated and partitioned for the fourth time in its history. Germany annexed western Poland directly, including the industrial region of Silesia and the Polish corridor. The central part of the country, including Warsaw, became the general government, a German colonial administration whose brutality was beyond imagination. It was ruled by Hans Frank, a Nazi lawyer and fanatical anti-Semite who treated the Polish people as subhuman. The Soviet Union took eastern Poland, incorporating it into the Ukrainian and Belarusian Soviet republics. Tens of thousands of Polish officers, intellectuals, and professionals were arrested by the NKVD and sent to camps. Many of them would never return. Over 200,000 Polish soldiers were killed or wounded. Civilian deaths numbered in the tens of thousands. Over 100,000 Polish soldiers managed to escape through Hungary, Romania, and Lithuania to continue the fight in exile. Poland was defeated on the battlefield, but the Polish nation would never surrender. An underground resistance movement, the Polish underground state, was already beginning to form, and it would become one of the largest and most effective resistance movements in all of occupied Europe. With Poland conquered, an eerie and deceptive silence settled over Western Europe. The period from October 1939 to April 1940 became known as the Phony War. The French called it the Drôle de Guerre, the Funny War. The Germans called it the Sitzkrieg, the Sitting War. It was a strange, surreal interlude, a war that was not yet truly a war. On the Western Front, French and German soldiers faced each other across the massive fortifications of the Maginot Line and the Siegfried Line, but there was almost no combat. Britain and France had declared war on Germany on September 3, 1939, but they had done virtually nothing to directly assist Poland during its time of need. The French army had been partially mobilized, but it remained firmly behind its defensive fortifications. There were timid plans for an offensive into the German Saar region in early September, but they were quickly abandoned after a brief and half-hearted advance. The British had dispatched the British Expeditionary Force, the BEF, to France, but it was still in the process of training, equipping, and deploying its forces. The prevailing Allied strategy was one of containment. They believed that a naval blockade, enforced by the overwhelming power of the British Royal Navy, could gradually strangle the German economy, cut off its supplies of oil, iron ore, and other essential materials, and eventually force Hitler to the negotiating table. They expected a long war of attrition, similar to World War I. They did not anticipate the new, mobile form of warfare that the Germans had just perfected in Poland. During the Phony War, life in Britain and France attempted to return to a semblance of normality. Evacuated children returned to the cities. Blackout regulations, which had been strictly enforced in the first days of the war, were relaxed. There was a growing sense, particularly among the public, that perhaps the war could still be avoided, that Hitler might be bluffing, that some sort of negotiated peace could be reached. This was an illusion, a dangerous fantasy. Behind the front lines, the German army was already planning its next devastating blow. While the armies sat idle on land, the war at sea was already being fought with full fury. The Battle of the Atlantic, which would become the longest continuous military campaign of the entire Second World War, had already begun. German U-boats, sleek and deadly submarines, lurked in the dark waters of the North Atlantic, lying in wait for Allied merchant shipping. The very first British merchant ship was sunk on September 3, 1939, just hours after the declaration of war. The U-boat threat would prove to be one of the most dangerous challenges the Allies would face. Two dramatic naval incidents captured the world's attention during these early months. On October 14, 1939, the German submarine U-47, commanded by the daring Lieutenant Commander Gunther Prien, penetrated the heavily defended British naval base at Scapa Flow in the Orkney Islands of northern Scotland. In a bold and brilliantly executed night attack, Prien torpedoed and sank the battleship HMS Royal Oak. The ship capsized in just 13 minutes, taking over 800 British sailors to their watery graves. The attack was a massive shock to the Royal Navy and a tremendous propaganda victory for the Kriegsmarine. It proved that no harbor was truly safe. In the South Atlantic, the German pocket battleship Admiral Graf Spee was wreaking havoc on Allied shipping lanes. Captain Hans Langsdorff, commanding this powerful warship, sank 9 British merchant vessels, totaling over 50,000 tons of shipping. But on December 13, 1939, the Graf Spee was cornered by 3 British cruisers, HMS Exeter, HMS Ajax, and HMS Achilles, off the coast of South America. In the resulting Battle of the River Plate, the Graf Spee was damaged and forced to take refuge in the neutral port of Montevideo, Uruguay. Faced with certain destruction if he tried to leave, Langsdorff made the difficult decision to scuttle his own ship in the River Plate estuary. A few days later, he took his own life rather than face the shame of defeat. The end of the Graf Spee was one of the few bright spots for the Allies in the early months of the war. The fall of Poland and the strange quiet of the Phony War marked the deceptive opening chapter of the Second World War. Poland had been sacrificed, her territory divided between 2 brutal totalitarian regimes, her people subjected to an occupation that would become a blueprint for Nazi terror across the whole of Europe. But the calm in the West was an illusion, a temporary pause before an even greater storm. Behind the lines of the Blitzkrieg, Hitler was already planning his next move. The German army was preparing Fall Gelb, Case Yellow, a massive offensive through the Ardennes forest that would sweep through Belgium, the Netherlands, and northern France, bypassing the Maginot Line and achieving what had seemed impossible since 1914, the defeat of France. The Phony War was about to end, and the world would never be the same again. Join us next time as we journey north to the frozen forests of Finland, where a tiny nation would defy the might of the Soviet Union in the remarkable Winter War.